and plunder the islands for sheep and cattle. You have to remember back then, you may know, there weren't very many trees. All this was cordwood country shipped out to New York and Connecticut and even overseas. So we were here to protect the island from the British. And there was actually an engagement, a very famous engagement, out at Oyster Ponds, further east. The whole area was called Oyster Ponds, so we don't know exactly where, but it was probably out at the point where the British were coming around to Plum Island to raid the cattle and sheep off of Plum Island. And at the time there was a Connecticut regiment here with the 3rd New York, and they were ordered to go to Plum Island to prevent the British from pulling off the sheep and the cattle from the island. So they got in the whaleboats, and they sailed across in their whaleboats to Plum Island, hopped out, landed, ran across the island, fired at the British, trying to keep the British from taking the cattle and the sheep. While that was happening, a sloop was coming around to cut them off. The Continentals saw that. They retreated, hopped back into their whaleboats, fired a little bit back and forth, and went back to Orient, and the British took the cattle and everything and went off, so they failed. But historically, that was the first engagement of the Continental Army, the New York Regiment, it was one of the first regiments, against the British Army. The militias were fighting the British in Boston and Lexington and Concord, but here on Long Island was the first engagement of the Army against Army. Not only that, but those guys that jumped out of those whaleboats and jumped onto Plum Island was the first amphibious landing of the Continental Army, of the American Army, forever. So the Marines have a plaque of the guys jumping off the whaleboats in their hall, and we have a little bit of fame to what was going on here. But for the most part, we had outposts set along the bluffs, watching for British ships, waiting for them to turn in. There was another engagement in Montauk, a famous fake-out. It's called Dayton's Ruse. Captain Dayton got orders to go to Fort Pond to prevent the British from offloading troops to plunder the island. And they wouldn't just take the sheep and the cattle, but they would plunder your home, and they might even take you as a hostage. So these were bad times back then. But Dayton was given orders, and he only had about 50 men. He got orders from Captain Hulbert. Hulbert sent a rider, gave Dayton orders to go to Fort Pond and repel the British. He had 50 men. So what Dayton decided to do in the last minute was he lined up his regiment behind a dune. And then he marched the regiment over the dune and then back around behind the dune again. The British were just watching from their ships, and he had all the men take off their regimentals and turn them inside out and go back over the dune again. And he kept having them change the regimentals inside out and whatever, change hats, change clothing. And he marched them over the dune so many times that the British thought that there was a whole company of men there, and they packed up and sailed out of the harbor, and they never landed. So that was Dayton's Ruse. So we had a few engagements. After the Battle of Brooklyn, Long Island was occupied, but Benjamin Talmadge of Setauket was a Connecticut regimental leader, and he led several raids on Long Island. Sag Harbor on the east end was probably the most famous raid. It wasn't by him, but Meade's raid was probably the most famous raid of the Continental Army onto Long Island while Long Island was occupied.